The crowd in Willow Creek's general store parted like the Red Sea as Lydia Graham entered, her gaze fixed firmly on the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. The whispers began immediately, hushed voices that weren't nearly quiet enough to hide their cruel intentions. Lydia clutched her woven basket tighter against her chest, ignoring the sting of tears threatening to form. In 1876, the small Montana town had plenty of gossip to share, but somehow Lydia's silence remained their favorite subject even after all these years. "Look who's here," Martha Wilson's stage whispered to her friend. The mute Graham girl, strange as ever. Lydia's shoulders tensed, but she continued forward, placing her items on the counter: sugar, coffee, and a small tin of hard candies she allowed herself once a month. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, took her carefully written list without meeting her eyes. "That'll be 87 cents, he muttered, gathering the items with unusual haste. Lydia counted out the coins precisely and slid them across the counter. Behind her, the whispers continued. She hadn't spoken a word since she was 12 years old, when the fever took her parents and little brother in the same terrible week. Something inside her had broken then, the trauma sealing her voice away like a locked door without a key. The town had decided her silence was unnatural, a willful oddity rather than a wound. At 22, Lydia had long ago accepted that Willow Creek would never understand. She managed her small farm alone, growing enough to sustain herself and selling the excess at market. She could hear perfectly well, could read and write with proficiency, but the absence of her voice had somehow made her less than human in the eyes of her neighbors. The bell above the door jangled as someone new entered the store. Through the corner of her eye, Lydia noticed a tall figure she didn't recognize, unusual in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. As Mr. Peterson handed over her purchases, the stranger's deep voice cut through the murmurs. "Afternoon, folks. Name's Dawson Nielson. Looking for some supplies before heading out to the Richardson property." A sudden hush fell over the store. The Richardson ranch had been abandoned for nearly 2 years after old man Richardson passed on. Rumors had circulated that a distant nephew might take it over, but nothing had come of it until now. Lydia kept her head down, tucking her purchases into her basket, but as she turned to leave, her shoulder collided with a solid chest. The impact sent her stumbling backward, and her basket tumbled from her grasp. The tin of candies clattered across the floor, spilling its colorful contents in every direction. Mortified heat flooded Lydia's face as she dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the scattered sweets. She was acutely aware of the eyes watching her, the smirks and judgmental glances. This was exactly the kind of attention she tried so desperately to avoid. "I apologize, madam," came that same deep voice, now much closer. "Let me help you with that." The stranger Dawson crouched beside her, his large, calloused hands carefully collecting the candies. Lydia kept her eyes fixed on the floor, wishing she could disappear completely. When most of the candies were recovered, he offered the tin back to her. "No sense in wasting good sweets," he said. Finally, Lydia looked up. Dawson Nielson wasn't like any man she'd seen in Willow Creek. His face was weathered from the sun, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. His jaw was strong, dusted with stubble, and his eyes were the clear blue of a summer sky. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, nothing fancy, but clean and well-maintained. Lydia accepted the tin with a small nod of thanks, quickly placing it back in her basket. "Cat got your tongue, Miss Graham?" Martha Wilson called out, her voice dripping with mockery. "Or are you just too good to speak to newcomers?" Before Lydia could react, Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "She doesn't talk, Nielson. Hasn't said a word in 10 years. Just ignores everybody like she's better than the rest of us." Lydia's chest tightened with familiar shame. She pushed herself to her feet, desperate to escape. "Is that so?" Dawson replied, standing as well. His voice held no judgment, only curiosity. "Well, I've known plenty who talk too much and say nothing worth hearing." Their gazes connected for a brief moment. To Lydia's surprise, there was no pity in his eyes, no disgust or mockery. Just a straightforward acceptance that knocked her off balance more than any collision could have done. With a final nod of acknowledgement, Lydia hurried from the store, the bell jangling behind her as she stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight. She untied her mare from the hitching post and secured her basket to the saddle, trying to ignore the tremble in her fingers. As she mounted her horse, she heard the store door open again. Dawson Nielson stepped out onto the boardwalk, touching the brim of his hat when he noticed her looking. "Miss Graham," he called out, "which way is the Richardson place from here?" Lydia hesitated, then pointed west, toward the mountains. "Much obliged," he said, and something in his easy manner made her linger a moment longer than necessary before turning her horse toward home. Over the next few weeks, word spread quickly about the new owner of the Richardson property. Dawson Nielson had indeed purchased the ranch and was working tirelessly to restore it to working order. He'd brought in cattle and hired a few hands from the next town over, becoming a topic of great interest among the local gossips. Lydia heard snippets of information when she ventured into town for supplies or to sell her vegetables at the Saturday market. Unmarried in his early 30s from somewhere in Colorado. Polite but private. A hard worker with fair business practices. A good shot but not a brawler. She tried not to think about him too much, though his face appeared in her mind more often than she cared to admit. Their paths crossed occasionally in town, and each time he greeted her with the same respectful nod he gave everyone else, never pushing for conversation, never drawing attention to her silence. It was during an unusually violent thunderstorm in late June that everything changed. Lydia had been securing her chicken coop when a particularly vicious gust of wind ripped a section of her barn roof clean off. The rain poured in mercilessly, threatening to ruin her stored hay and the tools she couldn't afford to replace. She worked frantically in the downpour, trying to salvage what she could, when the sound of hoofbeats approached from the road. Through the curtain of rain, she saw a rider approaching, hunched against the deluge. Dawson Nielson dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, taking in the situation at a glance. "Let me help," he shouted over the storm. Without waiting for a response that wouldn't come, he strode to the barn, assessing the damage with a practiced eye. For the next hour, they worked side by side in the relentless rain, covering the hole with a canvas tarp, securing it with rope, and moving the most vulnerable items to safer parts of the barn. When they'd done all they could, Lydia gestured toward her cabin, offering shelter from the storm that showed no signs of abating. Inside, she quickly stoked the fire in her small stove while Dawson removed his dripping coat and hat. "That should hold until the storm passes," he said, running a hand through his wet hair. "You'll need proper repairs, though." Lydia nodded, then held up one finger in a wait gesture before disappearing into her bedroom. She returned with a slate and chalk, items she rarely needed to use in her isolated existence. Carefully, she wrote, "Thank you for your help." Dawson read her words and smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached his eyes. "You're welcome, Miss Graham. I was on my way back from town when I saw your trouble." She wiped the slate clean and wrote again, "Please call me Lydia." "Lydia," he said, as if testing the name. "I'm Dawson, though I expect you already knew that in a town this size." She smiled slightly and nodded. After a moment's hesitation, she wrote, "Would you like some coffee? That would be mighty welcome." As Lydia prepared the coffee, an unusual sense of calm settled over her. Most people grew uncomfortable with her silence, filling the void with nervous chatter or avoiding her altogether. Dawson seemed content to simply be present, watching the rain through the window, occasionally commenting on the storm but never forcing conversation. When she handed him the steaming cup, he thanked her and took a careful sip. "Good coffee," he remarked. "Reminds me of how my mother used to make it." Lydia tilted her head questioningly. "She passed on 5 years ago," Dawson explained. "Lived with me in Colorado until then. After she was gone, I decided it was time for a change. Heard about this place from a cattle buyer in Denver. Lydia wrote on her slate, "Do you like it here?" Dawson considered the question. "The land's good, the people are." He paused, searching for the right word. "Well, they're like people everywhere, some kind, some not, some quick to judge what they don't understand." His gaze met hers directly, and Lydia knew he was referring to the town's treatment of her. Heat rose to her cheeks, and she looked away. "I don't put much stock in gossip," Dawson continued. "I'd rather form my own opinions based on what I see with my own eyes." Lydia hesitated, then wrote, "And what do you see?" Dawson took another sip of coffee before answering. "I see a woman managing on her own, working hard, living honestly. I see someone who's been misjudged by folks too narrow-minded to look deeper." He set down his cup. "Your silence speaks louder than words, Lydia. It tells me more about your strength than anything you could say out loud." Tears pricked at the corners of Lydia's eyes. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her with such understanding, such genuine respect. She blinked rapidly, trying to compose herself. The storm raged on, giving them reason to continue their unusual conversation. Dawson spoke of his ranch, his plans for breeding horses as well as cattle. Lydia wrote about her garden, the new varieties of vegetables she was experimenting with. Simple, ordinary topics that somehow felt extraordinary in the context of this unexpected connection. When the rain finally subsided to a gentle patter, Dawson reluctantly rose to his feet. "I should head back before dark," he said. "My foreman will be wondering if I've been washed away in the flood." Lydia nodded, accompanying him to the door. Before leaving, he turned to her once more. "I meant to ask, I'm looking for fresh vegetables for the ranch. The men are tired of preserved goods." "Would you be willing to sell to me regularly?" Lydia wrote quickly. "I would be happy to. Come by any time." "I'll do that," Dawson said with a smile that warmed her more than the stove had. "Thank you for the shelter and the coffee, Lydia." After he left, Lydia stood in her doorway watching until he disappeared around the bend. Something had shifted in her world, subtle but undeniable. For the first time in years, someone had looked at her and truly seen her. True to his word, Dawson began visiting Lydia's farm regularly to purchase vegetables. Each time, he would linger a little longer, their conversations deepening through her written words and his thoughtful responses. He brought books he thought she might enjoy, and she shared with him the preserves and baked goods that were her specialty. Word spread through town about Dawson's frequent visits to the silent woman's farm. The gossip intensified, speculation running wild about what a respected rancher could possibly see in that strange Graham girl. When Lydia went to town, she could feel the stares more acutely than ever, but somehow they stung less than before. One golden afternoon in late July, Dawson arrived with a wagon rather than on horseback. "I need your help if you're willing," he said after greeting her. "I've got a section of fence that needs mending on the north pasture. Could use an extra pair of hands." Lydia hesitated only briefly before nodding. She quickly gathered a few essentials and locked her cabin door. The ride to Dawson's ranch took nearly half an hour, giving Lydia time to observe the passing landscape, rolling hills dotted with wildflowers, the distant mountains etched against the clear blue sky. The Richardson property, now the Nielson Ranch, was larger than she'd imagined. A handsome two-story house stood surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings. Several cowboys were visible in the distance, moving cattle from one pasture to another. "Home, sweet home," Dawson said as they approached. "It's coming along, though there's still plenty to be done." He introduced Lydia to his foreman, a weathered man named Jim who tipped his hat respectfully, and then led her to the section of fence that needed repair. They worked side by side through the afternoon, replacing broken posts and stringing new wire. Though the work was strenuous, Lydia found it satisfying, especially under Dawson's patient guidance. When the fence was mended, Dawson invited her to stay for supper. "Mrs. Perkins comes in to cook for the men. She makes the best biscuits this side of the Mississippi." Lydia accepted with a nod, suddenly conscious of her work-worn clothes and wind-blown hair. Dawson didn't seem to notice, leading her to a small stream where they both washed away the day's dust and grime. The ranch house was simply but comfortably furnished, with sturdy wooden pieces and touches that suggested Dawson was making it a true home rather than just a place to sleep. Mrs. Perkins, a cheerful widow in her 50s, welcomed Lydia warmly, showing none of the judgment Lydia had come to expect. After a hearty meal shared with the ranch hands who followed their boss's lead in treating Lydia with casual respect, Dawson suggested a walk to aid digestion. The evening was perfect, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and sage as they strolled toward a small rise overlooking the property. "I come here sometimes at the end of the day," Dawson said as they reached the top. "Helps me remember why I'm working so hard." The view was breathtaking. The ranch spread out below them, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Beyond it, the mountains rose majestically, their peaks still touched with remnants of last winter's snow. Lydia wished she had brought her slate to express how beautiful she found it all. Instead, she simply smiled at Dawson, hoping her eyes could convey what her voice could not. "You know," Dawson said quietly, "I had a sister who didn't speak for almost 3 years after a fall from a horse. Doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong, said it was something in her mind that needed healing." Lydia looked at him in surprise. He had never mentioned a sister before. "She found her voice again eventually," he continued. "But those silent years taught our family something important, that there are many ways to communicate if people are willing to listen." He turned to face her fully, his expression earnest. "I don't know what caused your silence, Lydia, and you don't need to explain it to me. But I want you to know that I hear you, even when you don't make a sound." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes. She reached for his hand, squeezing it in wordless gratitude. Dawson's fingers tightened around hers. "I've grown mighty fond of you these past weeks," he admitted. "I find myself looking forward to seeing you more than just about anything else." Lydia's heart quickened. She wished desperately for her slate, for some way to tell him that she felt the same, that his presence in her life had awakened something she thought long dead within her. As if reading her mind, Dawson smiled gently. "You don't need to say anything. Your eyes tell me plenty." They stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon, their joined hands a promise neither needed words to understand. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Lydia's life. Dawson courted her properly, arriving at her farm with wildflowers and small gifts, taking her for rides across the countryside, even escorting her to church on Sundays where he pointedly ignored the whispers and stares, sitting proudly beside her in the pew. Not everyone approved of their relationship. Martha Wilson and her circle made their disapproval known through pointed remarks just loud enough for Lydia to hear. Even the pastor seemed concerned, pulling Dawson aside one Sunday to question his intentions toward the afflicted Graham girl. Dawson's response, which quickly became the talk of the town, was simple. "Miss Graham may not speak with her voice, but she communicates more honesty and goodness than most folks manage with 1,000 words. I count myself lucky to know her." As summer turned to autumn, Lydia and Dawson fell into a comfortable rhythm. She began spending more time at the ranch, helping with the kitchen garden. Mrs. Perkins had started and learning to work with the gentle horses Dawson was breeding. He, in turn, helped repair her barn roof properly and built new shelves for her preserves. It was during the harvest moon in September that Dawson brought Lydia to their special spot on the rise overlooking the ranch. A small table had been set up with a white cloth, candles, and a simple but elegant meal. "I wanted this to be special," he explained as he held her chair. They ate as the moon rose full and golden over the mountains, casting everything in a magical light. After the meal, Dawson took both her hands in his. "Lydia Graham," he said, his voice steady despite the nervousness she could see in his eyes, "these past months have been the best of my life. You've shown me that the deepest feelings don't always need words." Your silence speaks of strength, of resilience, of a heart that feels deeply." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I'm asking you to share your silence and your strength with me for the rest of our days. Will you marry me?" Inside the box was a delicate gold ring with a small pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was elegant without being ostentatious, perfect for working hands that still appreciated beauty. Tears streamed down Lydia's cheeks as she nodded emphatically, her heart too full for even written words. Dawson slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face gently in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs before leaning in to kiss her. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Lydia. Voice or no voice, you're the woman I want by my side always." The news of their engagement spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Reactions were mixed, but Dawson and Lydia paid little mind to the gossip. They were too busy planning their future together. The wedding was set for the first week of November, before the heavy snows made travel difficult. Lydia was surprised when several of the townspeople she'd long considered unfriendly offered congratulations or small gifts. Mrs. Perkins took charge of preparing Lydia's wedding dress, altering a beautiful cream-colored gown that had belonged to Dawson's mother. As the wedding day approached, Lydia found herself thinking more often of her parents and brother, how they would have loved Dawson, how her father would have proudly walked her down the aisle. The pain of their absence was an old, familiar ache, but now it was tempered by the joy of having found a new family. The night before the wedding, Lydia sat alone in her cabin soon to be rented to a young couple while she moved permanently to the ranch. She opened the small chest that contained the few mementos she had of her family. Her mother's cameo, her father's pocket watch, a lock of her brother's hair tied with blue ribbon. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to fully remember the terrible week that had stolen them from her, the fever that had struck so suddenly, the doctor's helplessness, her mother's delirious pleas, her father's rattling final breaths, her brother's small hand growing cold in hers. She remembered screaming until her voice gave out, and then, after the funerals, the silence that descended, a silence that had seemed safer than speech, a fortress against further pain. The town had never understood. They had seen only oddity where there was grief too deep for words. Dawson understood, though, without her ever having to explain. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp. Mrs. Perkins and Jim's wife, Ellen, helped Lydia prepare, arranging her hair with sprigs of dried lavender and adjusting the fit of her dress. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Perkins said, squeezing her hand. "Dawson is a lucky man." The small church was more crowded than Lydia had expected. Not just Dawson's ranch hands and business associates, but many townspeople as well, some perhaps drawn by curiosity, but others seemingly genuine in their well wishes. As Lydia walked alone down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Dawson waiting at the altar, she felt a curious lightness in her chest. He looked so handsome in his new suit, his face alight with love as he watched her approach. The ceremony itself was brief, modified slightly to accommodate Lydia's silence. When it came time for her vows, she had prepared to nod her assent, but to everyone's surprise, especially her own, something else happened instead. Looking into Dawson's loving eyes, feeling the warmth of his hands holding hers, Lydia opened her mouth and found her voice for the first time in a decade. "I do," she whispered, the words rusty but unmistakable. A collective gasp went through the church. Dawson's eyes widened in astonishment, then filled with tears of joy. The pastor, after a moment of stunned silence, continued with the ceremony, pronouncing them husband and wife with special emphasis. At the reception held at the ranch, Lydia spoke little, just a whispered thank you here and there to well-wishers. Her voice was weak from disuse, and speaking was still difficult, but the barrier had been broken. That night, alone in their bedroom in the ranch house that was now truly her home as well, Lydia found more words. "I love you," she said softly to her new husband, the three words carrying the weight of all she had held inside for so long. Dawson gathered her in his arms, his own voice thick with emotion. I loved you in your silence. I'll love you in your speech. Whatever way you choose to be, Lydia Nielson, you are perfect to me. Over the following months, Lydia's voice returned gradually. Some days words came more easily than others. On difficult days, she still relied on writing or gestures, and Dawson never pushed her to speak when she couldn't. The town's attitude toward her shifted, though some still regarded her with suspicion. Martha Wilson and her friends found new targets for their gossip, especially after Lydia and Dawson announced they were expecting a child in the summer. Their daughter, Emma Rose Nielson, was born on a bright June morning in 1878, healthy and strong with her father's blue eyes and her mother's dark hair. To Emma, Lydia sang lullabies and told stories, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. By the time their son Michael joined the family 2 years later, the Nielson Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. Dawson's horse breeding program had proven particularly successful, attracting buyers from as far away as Denver and San Francisco. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Dawson brought Lydia to their special spot on the rise, now featuring a comfortable bench he had built for them. The ranch spread out below them, thriving and beautiful in the autumn sunlight. Did you ever imagine we'd come this far? He asked, his arm around her shoulders. Lydia smiled, leaning against him. No, she said simply, but I'm grateful every day that you heard me when I couldn't speak. Dawson kissed her temple. Your silence spoke louder than words, my love. It told me everything I needed to know about your heart. As the sun set over their land, Lydia reflected on the journey that had brought her from isolated silence to this rich, full life. The pain of her past would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. What defined her now was this love given and received, a family created, a voice reclaimed. In the distance, Emma and Michael chased each other around the yard, their laughter carried to their parents on the evening breeze. Dawson and Lydia sat together in comfortable silence, watching the future they had built together unfold before them, a future neither of them had dared to dream possible until they found each other.